Hey programmers, welcome back to day 4 of the Advents of Code. So like always, we're going to be walking through the solution for day 4, so if you want to give it a shot on your own first, you've been warned. And so in this problem, we're going to be given a fairly large text file as our input. Here's just a little chunk of it. And so what they have here is really just some passport information. They tell us that every passport is going to be separated by a blank line. So that means in this particular example, I have 4 different passports. Along with that, a single passport can have a few different fields. We can have eye color, passport ID, expiration year, hair color, birth year, issue year, country ID, as well as the height. In this problem, we're asked to count the number of valid passports, and they provide some different criteria that we'll use to check and consider whether or not a passport is valid. I think most of the hardship in this problem will be about formatting the data and getting it into a shape where we can easily manipulate it for our validations. It's really unfortunate how kind of annoying this data is shaped, so we're going to have to do a lot of different work to actually finesse it into something that we can operate on. With that, I think we'll just hop right into the code for this one. All right, so here's our massive input file. It's pretty long, and ignore the fact that looks like my editor is actually highlighting all of these colors. And so let's start by just getting every entry within this text file. So here I have my part 1 boilerplate, and what I'm going to do this time around is when I go ahead and read the data from the file, they tell us in the problem that every entry is going to be separated by a blank line. And so to capture that information, what I'm going to do is to split on 2 new line characters. And the reason is, I know I'm going to have one new line character to start the blank line, and then another new line character to get from that blank line to the next entry. Something that's kind of annoying in this problem is when it comes to multiple entries, sometimes they may have some random new lines within it. So notice that on line 1 over here, after just the first field of eye color green, looks like they just break a line, although all of this information is still part of the same entry. And so let's go ahead and call our read entries function. So I'm going to call read entries, and I should obviously await that because it's going to be asynchronous. That'll give us our, we'll say, entries. So entries should be an array of exactly what we're looking for. Let's go ahead and just maybe test it and see what maybe the first entry looks like. So I'll print out entries, looks like at index 0, right? Let's give that a go. This will be part 1. Cool, and there we have some appropriate output. And so notice that for this first entry, again, we have that scenario where there's some random new line characters within it. I do want to separate each of these fields into maybe properties of an object. And so to do that, let me build a nice helper function. So what we'll do is we'll say const, we'll say parse entry. And it's going to take in a single entry string. And maybe I'll maybe just call this variable string. And so because I can't just split on the space character because I wouldn't be able to separate, this eye color from this CID. And so what we should do here, I think it's just split on all white space characters. That includes things like new line characters, tabs, as well as just single spaces. So what I'll do is I'll split my string and I'll use a regular expression. A really small one, we'll just look for a white space characters, which you can use using the S over here. So let's see what that gives us. That should give us our, we'll say, parts. I should have everything in a nice array. So I wonder what that one looks like now. So I'll call parse entry on just the first entry in the array right now. So I'll just replace this one. I'll call parse entry. Should just print out a nice array for me. Nice, so this is looking really good. And now I can finally separate each of these by a colon, it looks like. So I'll create an object that starts empty. By the end, I am going to return that object, but I should definitely assign it some key value pairs, right? So what I'm going to do is iterate through every part. So I'll say let part of parts. So that's going to grab every element of this array, which is going to be a string, and I'll go ahead and split that string on a colon. So if I do part.split, now on just a plain old colon, that should give me back an array of length 2. So I'll save that, maybe destructure it into the key and the value, right? So simply K and V. And then from there, I just want to really assign that key value pair into that object, which is as simple as object square bracket K equals V, right? So that's looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and see how this behaves on just that first entry over here. So I'm going to console.log what this function returns. Give that a go. Nice. So that's some well-formatted data, and that should make it easier to actually write our main algorithm. And so to start, maybe I'll just do a quick little map over all the entries. That way I get all of these objects ready to be, manipulated. So I'll say entries.map, and for every entry, parse it into an object. Right, so that'll give me my actual rows, we'll say. So now that we have an array of objects, I think we're actually ready to solve this problem. And for part one, all we need to do is just check for some required fields. Basically, they tell us that most of the fields of someone's passport data, which this is representing right now, are required except the country ID. So we don't need to actually check for that one, but all of these other ones are going to be required. So this is going to be pretty easy. What I want to do is count the number of rows that have the required fields. So maybe just to visualize things, I can do a console.table, I think, right now. And if I pass in my rows array, you should kind of be able to see what our data looks like. Let me spread this out a little bit. So if I scroll to the top of this, you can see the names of these, right? So these are all of the properties of every single object. Notice that some of the actual rows are missing entries. They tell us that the only thing you're allowed to, omit right now would be the CID. So an entry like this, that's missing a birth year, BYR, would be invalid. So to implement that, I think I'll just use a quick array to hold the required fields. So now that I have these required fields, basically all of them except the CID, now I'll just go ahead and start doing my count logic. So I'll say we'll say numValid equals 0. We know by the end of this, we're definitely going to return the number that are valid. But now we'll just go ahead and iterate through every row. So I'll say for every row or every object, I want to make sure it has every field inside of this array. So I can use some nice JavaScript syntax. I'll say required fields dot every. So that'll help me iterate through all of these fields. And for every single field, I'm going to check if it's inside of this row, which is simply, fields in row. So that should return a Boolean data. So if you're unfamiliar, the every method in JavaScript, it's an array method, and it's going to return true if every element of the array returns true when passed into this callback, right? So in other words, the only time that this every call returns true is when every field is inside of the row object. So I'll maybe name that to a variable. I'll say const is valid. And then it's just some quick condition. I'll say if the row is valid, then I can just go ahead and increment my count. Simply numValid ++. Awesome, so this is looking pretty good. If this is working, I should get the answer of 226. Let's give that a shot. Nice, and there we have part one. Nothing much to this problem. So I think at this point we can hop right into part two, which is a lot more tedious. So in part two, we still want to check and count the number of objects or passports that are valid, but this time they all have certain criteria. In other words, if I look at part two, basically all of the required fields have to be checked in a certain way. And the data in these properties can be pretty different. If you look at something like hair color, it's going to be, looks like a hexadecimal, a color representation. So we're going to have to probably create a few different functions to validate these different types of fields. So my plan is to create different functions to check for the different criteria over here. One thing that I noticed off the bat is these first three different fields. They're all about a year, and they're basically all validated in the same way. They just have different ranges. So maybe I'll start by creating a function to do just that range check. So here in my part two file, I basically have a lot of the same boilerplate as part one. So I'm still parsing every entry into the same type of object. But let me go ahead and create those helper functions now. So I think I'll start by creating, let's say, valid range. And I'm going to describe these in a particular way. I'm going to take in, let's say, the actual object. I'll just call that data. And we also need to check for the particular key. And then along with that, we need the min and the maximum. So this should be pretty straightforward. Let me start by checking if the key is even present within the data object. So I'll check, hey, if data of key, if that is undefined, then that tells me that, hey, this key isn't even a member of this object, right? It's not even present. So I can just go ahead and return false. Cool. But besides that, that means it must exist. So I better check that it's in this particular range. So I have to watch out here. What I want to do is access the number. So I'll say maybe val here. Then I'll go ahead and check if data at key, and I really want to turn that into a number, right? Because I know inside of my actual objects, they're going to be parsed as just strings, right? So if I just console.log, let's say the first row, so rows at index 0, that will be unfortunately some string data, right? So I'll actually just go ahead and turn it into a number in this valid range. And then the final part is pretty straightforward. I just want to make sure that, hey, this value is between min. That is, it's greater than min, but less than max. And we should be inclusive here. So simply, if min is less than or equal to val, and val is less than or equal to max. So this function should be good for checking all of those year types of fields. So I'm just going to paste in the requirements from the actual prompt. So these are all of the kind of validations we need to implement. And let's do all of the year ones, right? So I think I would even create some functions for birth year, issue year, and expiration year that actually delegate to valid range. In other words, I'd probably write a, let's say, valid birth year. And that's just going to take in the data, so just the object. And it's as simple as just returning whatever the result of valid range. And I'll pass in the appropriate data here, right? So same object, but I'll give in the actual key of birth year, as well as the range, which is 1920 to 2002. So something like this. Cool. I'll just create very similar functions for issue year and expiration year. So here are my 3 methods that check those years. Now let's move to height. So for height, it's going to be a number followed by either centimeters or inches, and depending on the units, then the number should actually fall into a different range. So let's start by just checking what the units is. So over here, I'll say const, and I'll say valid height. So that's at HGT, right? Yep. And I'll take in just the data. And I think I'll always start by checking if that key is actually present. So if data.hgt equals undefined, if it's not even there, then it's definitely invalid. So return false. But otherwise, let me go ahead and actually get the information out of it. In other words, height would look something like this. Let me make sure that I can look at the last 2 characters, right? It's either going to be in for inches or cm for centimeters. So what I can do is I can get maybe the const unit equals data.height not split, but rather slice, starting at the second to last character. So with the slice method in JavaScript, if I pass in a negative number, that refers to characters starting at the end, right? So -1 refers to the m, or the last character, and -2 refers to the second to last character. And because of that, it's actually going to start at that second to last character and slice all the way through the end. So this will give me the unit string. And so I'll check, hey, if the unit is equal to inches, I'll do some logic, and else if unit is equal to centimeters, then I'll do some opposing logic. But I also could have this scenario, I believe, where maybe my height doesn't end in a unit at all, right? And so what I'll do is else return false. Because they tell me in the actual instructions, it should be something that follows with cm or inches, right? Or in. So now I want to start looking at that number data for the height. I'm going to borrow, I think, a lot of this logic. So I'll go ahead and maybe paste this in over here. And when I get the number part, if I look at my examples, it should be basically everything starting from the beginning of the string, but up to not including the second to last character, right? So what I'll do is I'll save that over here. I can do number of data.height.slice, starting from the beginning all the way up to but not including -2. So I'll move this line over. And now my min for the inches was 59 to 76, so I'll fix that. And then for centimeters, it's 150 to 193. So this should be good to go, I think. All right, now we need to work on the hair color, which should be, looks like a hashtag followed by exactly 6 characters of 0 through 9 or A through F, sort of like a hexadecimal color. And so I think we'll just use a quick regular expression for this one. So let me just write this function. I'll just define it up here. This will be const valid hair color, takes in the data. And I should start by always checking if this field even exists, right? So I think I'll borrow this code, but adjust it for hair color, right? And then the actual regular expression that we can use for this one would look something like this. And I totally looked this up. I don't actually know how to write regular expressions that well offhand. When I look at this, we're calling the match method on a string, and we're passing in a regular expression. And so overall, what did some of these markers mean? Well, this caret refers to the front of the string, and this $sign refers to the end of the string. Of course, we need to have a hashtag, so that's why I have this character. And then we're using a group, right? So we're saying that, hey, for this group of 6 characters, you can have anything like 0 through 9, the numerics, or A through F, the letters. So this should be good to go. And then this match method will return you some like array information about where this matches throughout your string. But if it's not found, then you'll actually get back null. So what I can do is check if this is not equal to null. So if I get a response that's not null from this regular expression match, then it must have been a match, right? So I'll return over here. So let's go ahead and save this code. And maybe we'll even like test this. So let's say I copied just this bit. So how does this regex work? Well, let me say I passed in something valid like hashtag ABCDEF, right? It's exactly 6 characters of A through F. If I do my match on that thing, right, that'll give me a lot of information about how that match occurred and where I can find it. But let's say it didn't match, right? Let's say it had, I don't know, a Z in it. Then I get back null. And of course, you can totally follow the criteria that we kind of baked into the regular expression. You can have something like ABC 1, 2, 3, right? It's still going to be some valid hexadecimal. Cool, so that valid hair color is not too bad, just using some regex. Now we have eye color. Eye color is not really too exciting in my opinion. All it is just some fixed values. So I'll go ahead and create a quick way to do that. So like usual, we'll start by checking if the eye color property is even present in the object. And then from there, I'll just put all of these kind of fixed constant values into a set and make sure that the eye color is inside of that set. So here's my set of different color strings. And the reason I'm using a set is it has very fast lookup. So I can do now colors dot has the data dot eye color. Right? So whatever the value of the eye color is, we're going to check if it's inside of this color set. If it's there, then I get back true from this. If it's not there, I get back false, of course. So that's eye color. I think we have one more field. We just want to do the passport ID, which is a 9-digit number, including leading zeros. So that's pretty straightforward to do. So for valid PID, still going to check if that value is even there. And then we'll still use, I think, a regular expression. I'll borrow this one. I think we can just finesse it a little bit. So we definitely want to be checking the PID over here for a match. And we don't need a hashtag in it, they say. They just want a 9-digit number and of just numeric, so 0 through 9. So it should look something like this. So I think at this point, we're ready to give this one a test. There's a lot of different functions here. Probably we'll have to debug it a little bit. But now that I have all of these functions that validate each of the fields, I think I could just, use an array of all of these functions. So I'll kind of show you how that looks like. In other words, I'm going to create maybe const validators. So as the elements, I'll start by putting my different functions. So valid birth year, then of course a valid issue year. And I'll do this for all the functions I made. Now that I have an array of all these validators, I can start my main logic of counting things that are valid, right? So I'll say let num valid, like before, starts at 0. I'm going to iterate through every row. I'm not sure why that happened. So I'll say for let row of rows. And I want to make sure that this row satisfies every validator. So like before, I'm going to use validators dot every. So I'm using that nice every method. Then for every, we'll say validator singular, I want to actually call it and pass in the row, right? So remember that all of these valid functions just take in the data object. So this is already compatible. So I'll call validator on the actual row data. Nice. So this is looking pretty good. This will give me a Boolean response. It'll give me true only if every validator returns true, right? So I'll call that const is valid. And now I can just go ahead and check that Boolean, right? So if it is valid as a row, then I'll just increment numValid. And after this for loop, I can just return numValid, right? So there we keep our main function relatively clean, although it was a lot of work to create these individual validators, right? In a perfect world, we could use something like a validation library in JavaScript, but I figured we should probably not do that too much in the advent of code. So let's try this. If this is working, I think I have the answer here. We should get 160. So give it a shot. Nice, and it looks like we have our 160. So there we have day 4 of the advent of code. This problem, not really too much of a fan of it. It's more kind of tedious than anything, but at least we get to just bang out a lot of code. Not a lot of like data structures and algorithms or algorithmic thinking in this one, although I guess we get to really practice keeping our code as clean as possible. So with that, I'll catch you tomorrow.